A warning, this podcast talks about issues raised in the Polkinghorne trial, including death and suicide.
Dr. Philip Polkinghorne, retired eye surgeon, is accused of murdering his wife Pauline Hanna in their Remuera home on Easter Monday 2021 and staging it as suicide.
Polkinghorne's lawyer Ron Mansfield KC has been blunt in his assessment of why his client has ended up in court charged with murder. He told the jury that during an investigation spanning 16 months, police became intoxicated by salacious details of sex and drugs and transfixed in their belief that Hanna was murdered.
The jury is out in the trial of Philip Polkinghorne, expected now to pick through the evidence to untangle the truth and deliver a verdict. Over the course of the trial, they've heard about drug analysis.
Part of the Crown's case is that Mr. Polkinghorne's behaviour was influenced by methamphetamine use. Former drug analyst Cameron Johnson had tested 6 separate samples of white crystalline powder found hidden throughout the Upland Road home.
They've heard about DNA from bloodstains.
DNA analyst Timothy Power says Mr. Polkinghorne's DNA was found on at least 3 bloodstains, including on a handrail near the garage door.
They've even heard about how a toaster causes a spike in energy use.
Mechanical engineer Dr. Paul Smith was asked to analyse the energy use at the couple's Remuera home on the morning of Ms. Hanna's death. Mr. Polkinghorne had told police that he found Ms. Hanna's body early in the morning after making tea and toast for breakfast. But Dr. Smith says the kettle and toaster could not have been used between 4 a.m. and 7:30.
I reasonably think we can rule out the use of the kettle or the toaster in that period because the energy increase over the baseline is not sufficient to support their use.
In 2024, is there anything science can't do? Well, yes. Yes, there is.
A forensic pathologist says he cannot determine the exact cause of death of an Auckland woman the Crown believes was murdered by her husband. Dr. Kilak Keisha carried out the autopsy examination of Pauline Hanna.
When speaking about suicide versus intentional strangulation, a forensic pathologist told the court he cannot rule out one over the other.
Dr. Kilak Keisha says he kept Ms. Hanna's cause of death very vague. He says his finding was compression to the neck resulted in Ms. Hanna's death, but he could not determine the cause of the compression.
Kia ora, I'm Gwen McClure, and today on The Detail, I want to know why not? Shouldn't forensic science be able to tell us whether someone died by hanging or was strangled by another person? I've spent most of my adult life on a steady diet of crime dramas, giving me the idea that just one hair or one fingerprint will be the missing piece of a puzzle that will solve a crime. But it turns out, sometimes something can look like evidence, but mean nothing at all.
I think forensic science has actually gone through a little bit of a crisis internationally where we've actually looked at ourselves and said, do we have data to actually support what we're saying? Do we have the right information to be saying something is likely or unlikely? I mean, these are key kind of phrases where people hear them and think, gosh, a scientist is saying something's likely. There must be some sort of data or something to support that. So we're re-looking at what we're actually saying, the words that we're using, how we're presenting findings to make sure that we are expressing uncertainty where we should be.
So where aren't scientists certain about the science? What can forensics tell us, and what can't it? Paige McElhinney is director of the Forensic Group Limited. She's been a forensic scientist for more than 20 years.
I now consult for defence lawyers. I work with the Criminal Cases Review Commission, inquiries from the Law Commission, basically helping both prosecution and defence counsel making sure that the science before the court is as good as it can be.
Paige can't talk about the Polkinghorne case, but can talk more generally. But let's back up for a moment and cover the basics. What is forensic science?
It is a huge umbrella term for basically any science that can assist in the investigation of crime. So it can include anything from fingerprints, DNA, firearms, ballistics, drug analysis.
Walk me through the process that you go through. So there's a crime, say a death, or there's, I suppose, a suspected crime. Where does your job start?
So my job starts now with questions from Defence Counsel. So that's at the end of the investigation stage. So when a crime occurs, you have an initial investigation phase where the crime scene's examined, samples are taken, samples are analysed, and those results are provided. And this all happens before court. The results are provided to both prosecution and defence counsel, and they're left to decide what those findings actually mean. And that's where I come in and look at the findings, figure these out within the context of a case, and provide guidance on what those findings actually mean.
Okay. Turning to some hypothetical examples. So let's say you have a case where someone has been found dead. What are we looking at here? How would the cause of death be determined there?
So the first step with that would be the scene examination. So it's looking at whether there's anything within the scene that can aid with the reconstruction of what actually occurred. So is there any indication of another person, entry into the scene by somebody else? So it's footwear impressions, fingerprints, bloodstain patterns, putting together exactly what's present in the scene to start with. Then the attention turns to the body itself. So samples are taken, fingernail scrapings, hairs, fibres, impressions, all that sort of information is also collected as well.
And what about the body itself? I mean, are we looking for, I guess you've talked about the fingernails, but are we looking for the way that the body is found, that sort of thing?
Absolutely. Everything from the position of the body, how it was found, any marks on the body, they're all going to aid the forensic pathologist in determining that cause of death.
Okay. Then you get to court and you have experts giving their opinions on this. They don't agree. So how can two people look at the same evidence and come to completely different conclusions?
It's a hard one because, you would think that something like cause of death would be a clear-cut answer. But sometimes science doesn't have an answer, that there's only so much information that we have available to us and we can't go any further. And I think that's something to be really clear of, not just with pathology findings, but with other science as well, is sometimes there is no answer and we can't provide an answer. The fact that there's two opposing opinions makes it more difficult because it's now left to a jury to decide which of those experts they believe more, which of those experts they like more, and you're asking lay people to make a decision on cause of death with really no experience or training.
Yeah. Do you have to sort of dumb down some of the complicated aspects of what you do for a jury?
I think it's really important that any expert is a science communicator. It's not dumbing down, it's you have to make yourself understandable. It helps nobody to make your findings complicated. It has to be understandable and explained in such a way that someone with a degree in marketing can actually understand what it is that you're explaining.
How important is forensic evidence in a court case? Is it more important than establishing a motive, or more important than a witness testimony, or does it depend on the case, or how does that balance work?
It's absolutely case dependent, because often you can have witness statements or other information and the forensic science may tell you nothing. For example, if it's a homicide in a house, for example, where two people are known to frequent, then DNA is not going to tell you anything because the DNA can transfer before the incident or during the incident or whatever. It's expected that their DNA will be there. So a DNA analyst isn't going to be able to add anything to that investigation because we would expect DNA to be there.
Okay. And so in that case, we're looking through kind of the story a lot more than the science.
Exactly right. But it's also putting that science in that context. So while you may have a DNA analyst get on the stand and give evidence that DNA was detected, the jury need to consider that might not answer any questions. Just because DNA was detected, we can't answer how it was transferred or when it was transferred. And it's up to the jury to know that there are limitations to those scientific findings.
And we saw that kind of scenario play out in the Polkinghorne case.
A partial DNA profile was obtained from the sample, partial meaning that DNA results were obtained at some but not all of the DNA sites we tested. Where results were obtained, they corresponded to Mr. Polkinghorne's reference DNA sample, and therefore the DNA in that sample could have originated from him.
Mr. Mansfield asked whether the DNA could have already been on the handrail before the bloodstain.
We can't attribute any of the DNA detected to the probable blood in that sample.
You can't tell us whether the DNA, to the extent this is relevant, is in the probable blood or on the handrail itself.
Correct.
I would expect that you can just go to a crime scene, dust for fingerprints, or pick up a hair with your gloves and put it in a little plastic bag, and then that's that. What does it actually look like?
I'm actually a little bit guilty on this as well, because I have a long history of answering questions. Is your job like CSI? With a big yes. I think we've all grown up as a generation on true crime, on crime dramas, on forensic science. Look at all the amazing things we can do within a short period of time, and a really easy answer for every single investigation. Science solving crimes. And I think that there is one of the biggest problems, because science doesn't solve crimes. It's a tool to assist in the investigation of crimes. So I think we need to change our mindset in that science is not necessarily solving anything at all. It's just adding more questions almost that we need to consider. We need to consider these findings a bit further rather than just a blanket exception of everything that we see.
Okay. You said you've been doing this for about 20 years, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. So in the 20 years that you've been working in this field, has the science itself improved drastically?
Absolutely. I think any science is evolving over time. Now, what we see in forensic science is concentration on detection. So we see developments in how sensitive DNA analysis is, how sensitive drug detection is, how sensitive gunshot residue analysis is. So we've seen this huge body of research. I mean, we're having DNA profiles from a very few number of cells. We're looking at DNA profiling on the go, taking rapid identification kits to scenes. I mean, this is where the technology is going. What we're missing is the huge body of research that then discusses what these findings mean. And this is where we're seeing money and time and investment in determining what those findings mean. Because if you have an answer, you have a detection of a substance, what we need is a clear explanation for a jury who don't read scientific journals. We need a clear explanation for them to say, this is what you need to consider when reviewing these findings.
Can you give me some examples of cases or of particular areas of the science where it's more fallible than we might think?
I think one area that I suppose even surprised me in my career is fingerprint identification. And even in that term, fingerprint identification, is problematic, because what we have is a comparison between two items by a human looking for similarities, essentially. So there is this long tradition that fingerprint comparisons was infallible, fingerprint comparisons was an identification. But we now see that, like every other area of forensic science, it is prone to human error and human bias. We can look to a case in the US where Brandon Mayfield was associated with the Madrid bombing in 2004. So he was actually arrested based on his apparent fingerprint being located on a bag containing detonators. So the FBI's top experts said with 100% certainty the fingerprints originated from Mr. Mayfield.
Mayfield was arrested after this smudged partial print found on a bag of detonators was matched to his, not by one FBI examiner, but 3.
And you can imagine what he went through with the spotlight of justice shining upon him and what he went through in his life based on this so-called identification, which turned out to be wrong.
I honestly felt like I was being framed because I hadn't been out of the country for over 10 years.
So different examiners looking at the same thing coming up with different conclusions.
How did they determine it was wrong?
So he couldn't have actually been there. It was actually impossible for him to have been there, and the Spanish fingerprint authorities conducted the same examination and excluded him.
2 weeks after Mayfield's arrest, Spanish investigators found the man to whom the fingerprint really belonged. It turns out a partial distorted print, like the one the FBI had, often yields multiple potential matches. In fact, when the Madrid print was put into the government's automated system, 20 prints with similarities came up, including Mayfield's.
A few years later, a researcher named Itiel Dror led a study to show just how much bias context can create in fingerprinting.
Right, so if we look at the Fingerprint Project, what they did was they provided fingerprints to a number of fingerprint experts. They gave them a little bit of contextual information that wasn't actually true, but it led them to believe that these were associated with the Mayfield case that we've talked about, and asked them to review the comparison. What they actually did was handed back to them their own cases that they'd already testified for, that people had already been convicted for, and asked them to reevaluate their comparison that they'd made between the known impression and the seen impression. 4 out of 5 of those examiners changed their conclusion. So based solely on the information that they were given prior to doing that comparison, they changed their conclusion.
So just how much human error is in this science?
I don't want to call it human error because it's not something that we're conscious of. I mean, everybody is just trying to do the best job they can. They work hard, they're doing what they know with their background and their experience. But we are human, and that means that we are prone to bias. And like bias is used as this dirty term that, oh gosh, scientists shouldn't be biased. That's a terrible, terrible thing. But we're actually just humans. So the information that we receive in our environments changes how we perceive things and how we look at things. And this is not something that we're aware of. There is research in bias in forensic science, and this is in fingerprints and DNA and pathology, and it really shows how information will change how we see things.
So you are hired by the defense, is that right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So how does that play in? How can you be as impartial as you can be when you kind of know what your client wants you to find?
One of our guiding documents is the High Court Code of Conduct for Expert Witness, which means that you're not an advocate for the party that instructs you. And that's one of our foundations, is that if the science is pointing to your client being guilty, then that's what we'll tell you. And then that means that it can be an early guilty plea or resolve things a lot more quicker for everybody. What we can do is provide advice on what the findings do and don't mean, questions that need to be asked. Because as a scientist, I remember standing in the box and being asked questions, and I would be waiting for the questions that needed to be asked because I'd provided, I found a blood stain on the wall. Prosecution would ask the questions, and then the defence would get up and I'd be like, right, here we go, ask me what it means, but no questions would come. So I think that's a really valuable role that we play in this system, is getting the right questions being asked in court.
Are you seeing a lot of cases where forensic evidence has caused somebody to be found guilty and you strongly think it was incorrect?
We see a lot of cases coming through. I mean, we probably only see maybe 5% of cases that are actually going through the New Zealand courts. But often we stop cases going to court, or we get not guilty verdicts just because we highlight those issues with the forensic science. So luckily we get in at that stage before conviction. We also now see cases coming through the Criminal Cases Review Commission or people appealing their convictions, and forensic science often plays a part in that. If we look at cases such as the case of Alan Hall, for example, that is a case where he was convicted of the murder of Arthur Easton. There were multiple issues with that case in terms of witness statements which made the media, but also forensic science was presented to the jury in that case to consider as well. There was a fibre found on his top. This was linked to Mr. Hall by an item that he had in his possession. So this was presented to the jury as a scientifically significant finding. One single fibre, one single blue polyester fibre. What needed to be considered there is how common is a blue polyester fibre? How does a single fibre transfer? Fibres can transfer directly from individuals, can transfer by seats, people you brush past. Often a single fibre, there's absolutely nothing we can say about that. And even now, we probably wouldn't present that at trial. But at his trial, that was presented as a scientifically significant finding. It turns out that the item that was actually linked to that blue polyester fibre was actually purchased after the murder.
But it's not just context around evidence that can be misinterpreted. There are also some areas where the science just isn't there.
There was a large number of cases which involved bite mark analysis. And this was determined to be this identification, again, key word that we use, identification through bite marks. This was shown to be pretty much junk science, that all these people were convicted based on bite marks which change. They change with healing, they change with how they were made. There is no data on how common or uncommon a particular bite mark is, but we went through a whole phase in our history where bite marks were an identification. Now what we're seeing is DNA analysis coming along for those people that do get permission to have their findings revisited, DNA analysis coming along and exonerating them. I think there is this expectation that forensic science is going to give results. There is an expectation that, well, if something happened then there'll be DNA 100%. I think there needs to be some sort of education that it is not always possible. There are often times we cannot say anything.
That's all for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. This episode was engineered by William Saunders and produced by Alexia Russell and Davina Zimmer. Thanks to Paige Micklehenney. I'm Gwen McClure. Mā te wā.